So it's my pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon. We're here today to talk about data in its broadest sense. The name of our webinar is From Insight to Implementation, Building a Sustainable High-Performance Workplace. And what we're going to do is talk through a little bit around data, its value, how you gather data, what kind of data to gather. And then we're going to look in a little bit more detail at some of the data that we gather here at Mind Forward Alliance through our Thriving at Work assessment. And then we're going to jump into the Q&A section with Karen and Alison. And towards the end, I'll make sure there's enough time for questions from the crowd. In terms of being able to ask any questions, if there's any questions that you would like to ask of either Karen or Alison, there is a Q&A function, and/or you can use the chat functionality as well. So please feel free to use either of those if you've got any questions, and we'll do our best to come to them in good time. So it's my pleasure to first hand over to Alison, please.
Hello, everyone. Lovely to see so many joining us on the session today. So, as Phil said, I'm Alison Unstead. I'm the Chief Executive of Mind Forward Alliance. So my role today really is to talk to you a little bit around how we use wellbeing data to drive better decisions and, more importantly, better wellbeing outcomes for your people. I'd like to start by saying that, workplace mental health should be seen as a critical business issue. We know it affects productivity, it affects risk, it affects business performance, and we now have the data to prove it. So I'm going to start with some research and some of the big picture numbers, and many of you on this call will be familiar with some of these. So if we look at costs, the World Health Organization estimates that depression and anxiety cost the global economy approximately $1 trillion per year in lost productivity. In the UK, Deloitte's most recent mental health report estimates the cost of poor mental health to employers at £51 billion per year. Now, that's significantly increased in recent years, with the majority of that cost being related to presenteeism rather than costs of absence. But on a more positive note, if we think about the opportunities, according to the World Economic Forum, improved well-being is worth up to $9 trillion globally through increased productivity and reduced presenteeism. Deloitte research has also found that for every £1 invested in mental health interventions, employers see an average return on investment of £5. Now, there's also some global research that was published by Gallup last year that shows that employees that are thriving in wellbeing are 66% less likely to experience burnout and 81% less likely to be actively seeking another job. Now, according to McKinsey, burnout is one of the top 3 reasons why a person decides to leave their job. There's also a recent research study by the University of Oxford's Wellbeing Research Centre with BT, which showed that a 1-point increase in employee wellbeing, and that was on a scale of 0 to 10, was associated with a 12% increase in productivity, rising to a 20% increase in productivity in emotionally complex roles. Research also from the Oxford Wellbeing Research Centre has shown that organisations with higher levels of employee wellbeing are showing stronger return on assets, demonstrating higher gross profitability, and have outperformed major stock indices by approximately 20%. See, from a data perspective, this really shifts wellbeing from being simply one of the very many HR data points or metrics that we might be looking at to a financial performance indicator. Now, the figures I've given you today are obviously important in looking at the kind of wider context, so to sort of demonstrate, I guess, the scale of the challenge, but also the scale of the opportunity for employers and also for larger economies. But often when we talk about $1 billion here, $1 trillion there, and the global impacts, these numbers do feel a little bit abstract. So I think the useful question for us to consider is, what do these figures mean in the context of your own organisations? Because behind every large statistic sits something far more tangible. For example, what is the cost of your manager time spent dealing with preventable performance issues? Or manager hours lost in your organization for managers responding to issues relating to conflicts or supporting employees who may be experiencing poor well-being or issues such as burnout. And then there is also the time and the cost invested in recruiting and onboarding replacement talent. But the challenge we face, particularly as well-being practitioners, is that these costs never really appear very clearly on the balance sheet. Now, from a productivity perspective, we know intuitively that when people are not well, they do not perform at their best. And ways in which this may show up in your organization from a data perspective is it may show up as lower outputs, lower quality of work, lower levels of engagement, lower levels of or reduced discretionary effort, which is very much linked to levels of engagement. There may be slower decision making, there may be increased errors that are being seen. In other words, poor well-being often represents a sort of hidden cost, a hidden performance tax. It's another way I've heard it described on business. And when we start to view it through that lens, not just as a people or a HR issue, but as a productivity and risk issue, the strategic importance becomes much clearer to business leaders. Now, according to 87% of business leaders, improving employee well-being brings competitive advantage. Yet only around 25% of those leaders say they have a comprehensive strategy, well-being strategy in place. So to engage leaders, we must recognise that there are different inputs and actions that will motivate people in different ways. Now, for some, and probably the most impactful thing organisations have done is engaged in activities such as storytelling, so sharing the human experience, the real life stories, the emotional impact that has created this call to action and has also done a huge amount to help reduce levels of stigma. But the storytelling doesn't always resonate equally with everyone. And for others, it's very much around this hard data. It's the performance implications, it's the cost exposure, it's the productivity opportunity that gets the attention. So some leaders are persuaded by the human story, and others will be persuaded by the data. The most powerful approach is not choosing between the two, it's really a combination of them both. And when we bring together those human stories with that hard data, we create both the emotional engagement and that commercial credibility. And that is when leadership attention truly shifts. So, what should be your approach to using data to measure your approach? Well, I'd like to just reference our Thriving at Work framework. So, this is very much our model. It's effectively a blueprint for how organisations can develop their approaches to developing their wellbeing strategy. It's a whole organisation approach. It looks at the culture that is developed within organisations. It looks at the working practices, and it looks to the extent in how organisations are supporting employees who may need help. Now, there is a section within that framework from page 23, if you have it open in front of you right now, that does talk about impact and measurement. So there's lots of really good information. So I would certainly recommend looking in that framework. But from my perspective, there are three core functions, I guess, of the data that you'll have available to you. And when we're talking about data, I think one of the first things to do is really think about a bit of exploration around what data do I have available to me, because this isn't always about trying to create new sources of data or gather new sources of data. Actually, there is a lot of data that you will already have available to you. And we don't have time to go into those lists. Again, please do refer to the framework for some examples of that. But from my perspective, there are very much three core functions here in terms of how you use data. One is to use data as a learning tool. So I think it's really important to understand, particularly in the beginning of developing your wellbeing strategy, where you are right now. Do you understand the levels of employee wellbeing? in your organization? Do you understand the kind of drivers, the things that promote employee well-being, what employees want, and what really helps them? Do you understand what the demands may be on some of those employees and how that may be affecting their well-being? And particularly, this is, a very essential activity in understanding perhaps where you are exposed to risk. So learning and understanding kind of, your baseline, where you are right now, data is going to be fundamental to that piece of work. But data can also be helpful to the next area, which is around, well, where do I go from here? What are the outcomes, that we want to see? What are the things that I need to do as a leader what are the things I need to prioritize? So data can be really helpful in assisting some of that decision making, prioritizing the actions that you need to take and directing focus to where you want to see the most return. And then lastly, it's about accountability. It's about, ensuring that there are the right levels of governance, the right levels of ownership at the right levels of the organization. And this is very much from that most senior executive board level leadership all the way through to the kind of grassroots employee base. So what we want to see data being used for is also around that accountability. So demonstrating the value in what you're doing and holding leaders especially to account. And also that reporting back into the exec and board level committees. Because without this data, this reporting, well-being remains very much an anecdotal thing. And with data, it is very much a strategic activity. So if we think about what you should be measuring, too often I think organisations focus on some of these kind of, these outcomes or these sort of lagging indicators such as sickness absence, incidents of burnout. But the real opportunity here often lies in what we would call a leading indicator or predictors that allow us to intervene earlier and more effectively. So just some examples of lagging indicators. So that may be things like mental health related to absence, turnover. You could be looking at mental health intervention utilization, EAP utilization. But there are also leading indicators. So these are some of the things that might indicate where perhaps some of the challenge and some of the opportunity may be. So leading indicators may be things like levels of engagement, levels of job satisfaction and happiness, levels of stress. You might have scores related to psychological safety. It could be workload and utilization data. It could be client, customer satisfaction data. So there's lots of data there that can really help build a much fuller picture around what is happening in your organization. And in terms of what we see leading organizations do with this data, well, firstly, it's about, as part of the kind of strategic approach, establishing really clear, measurable KPIs and using data to follow that. And in doing that, tracking both, as I said, the lagging and the leading indicators, and very much looking at outcomes to kind of manage wellbeing proactively, not just reactively. Leading organisations are using this as a reporting tool. And again, as I said, it's about reporting all the way up to that kind of board and executive level. We would strongly advocate for wellbeing data to be used in wider organisational reporting, so whether that's in annual reports, sustainable business reports, just to make sure that, again, wellbeing is not seen as this initiative or something that's done on the sideline. It's very much an integral part of how your organisation measures its performance, particularly in relation, obviously, to people. We see organisations using this data to inform kind of their investment, their resource allocation, and the decisions that they make in terms of what they're prioritising. And organisations also using this data in a very intelligent way. So you may have various data points, but disaggregating that data, for example, by demographic group, can really help to identify the needs and experiences of different groups of employees, but also target the kind of interventions and the actions that they will take as an organisation. And then there's also the benchmarking. And now Phil is going to talk a little bit more about the Thriving Work assessment that we do. But benchmarking can be a really helpful tool to assess where you are on your journey as an organisation, particularly when you're looking and comparing yourself to peers. And then lastly, data being used to kind of continually refine and develop the strategy and very much using it as a tool to assess kind of what is working, but just as importantly, what is not working in the organisation. So I just have a couple of sort of final remarks really about data. I mean, the first one is just really to be careful about how data is interpreted. Now, data is only, I mean, data can be interpreted in many different ways. So you can have one data point and look at that, that can tell you various things depending on what you want to see. So data is only valuable really if it's interpreted thoughtfully and in context. So, for example, an increase in mental health related absence, for example, doesn't necessarily mean mental health is worsening in the organisation. It may mean that stigma around disclosing mental health may be reducing, which is why, alongside the numbers, the narrative is incredibly important. And our role as wellbeing practitioners and wellbeing leaders is to interpret that data responsibly. So I'm going to leave it there and hand back to Phil, who's going to talk to us a little bit about our assessment. Thank you, Phil.
Thanks, Alison. Really good summary of data in its many forms. Just going to bring up some slides, and there's not many slides. I don't want this to be death by PowerPoint this afternoon. You'll see in the chat that we've added the link to our framework. So if you're not familiar with it, or if you haven't had a chance to click the link and have a look, then you can obviously do that either now as I'm speaking or after the call. I will touch on a couple of slides around the framework just to explain what it is, and then get through these slides and jump into the interesting bit, which is going to be chatting with Karen and Alison about their experiences, particularly Karen, and how data is being used at BDO. So if we can go to the next slide, please, Vicky. Alison actually covered all of this off. She spoke about some of the data points and some of the statistics that sit around mental well-being, being a business imperative, being the right thing to do, but also being a really strong commercial driver for organizations. So I think the business case has been made. Let's jump to the next slide. What I've pulled on here is, for those of you that work in the wellbeing space and are responsible for gathering data, this is probably not an exhaustive list, but a lot of data points that you have access to. And there's a huge amount. And it can actually be quite challenging to know what data to gather and why you're gathering it. And this goes back to what Alison said, which is having a strategy that's well formulated, having a destination that you are aiming for and a plan on how to get there, and then deciding what data will help you measure success against that plan is really imperative. So it's not data for data's sake. This is all about aligning what data you have and what data you're going to gather to what you're trying to achieve. And that's just, this page is just a fairly good coverage of the sort of data that as HR and wellbeing practitioners you would have access to, and there's a lot of it. I have actually highlighted the Thriving at Work assessment because the next 3 or 4 slides I'm just going to touch on that particular data set, if you like. So if we can move to the next slide, please, Vicky. Thank you. So what is the Mindful Alliance framework and what does the assessment measure? Well, both examples here, or both the framework and the assessment sit hand in hand. So you can see the framework sits around 3 pillars, around culture, around environment, and around support. And then within those pillars, we have 10 standards. I'm not going to read them all out. This framework was developed in partnership with Oxford University, and it's designed to provide a benchmarking tool for you against all of the standards that you see on the screen in front of you. That's just gone. Just lost the screen. Apologies.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
Lost it. Just bring it back up. Give us a moment.
Yeah.
Thanks, Vicky. So, as I said, 10 standards, and these standards sit around 3 pillars. So if we can jump to the next slide. for for those companies that choose to take part in the Thriving at Work assessment, and those are some of our member companies do that, or many of our member companies do that, but non-member firms also take part. And in fact, some of our member firms and others decide to do the report in more than one jurisdiction. So when we provide access to the report, we allow a company to choose whether they want to respond on behalf of a particular country, for example, the United Kingdom, whether they want to complete it on behalf of a region, so for example, EMEA or APAC, or whether they want to respond as a company on a global basis. And that's entirely driven, the choice is entirely driven by the organization. And some organizations who may be global choose to, have we lost it again? Okay, no worries. I will try sharing my screen. Unfortunately, Vicky's screen keeps dropping. So give me one moment while I bring up the presentation. Forgive me a moment while I just find the presentation. Nothing like a little glitch to keep you on your toes, is there? Right. Okay. Did that come up? Yeah. Perfect. So as I said, we allow organizations to choose whether they want to respond at a local country level, a regional level, or a global level. And we also ask them what more, put them into a particular peer group. So you can see on this redacted presentation here, we have a company whose most recent Thriving at Work report was collected and measured, the financial services company. They've responded as a UK company or on behalf of the UK. And this is their report. Now, I'm only showing a small selection of the pages from what is a very detailed report. So overall, what we do is we provide our organizations that take part in the assessment with an accreditation level, starting with committed, through achieving, excelling, and then health creating is the top accreditation. So you get an overall score out of 801 points. And you can see here that we also provide a summary of organizational strength, areas of development, and then we get specific benchmarking. So this organization can benchmark itself against its peer group. In this case, it was financial services, and then against all those companies that took part in the survey. We also provide geographical benchmarking as well. So we can, if this company is a UK company, we can share with them data around how they performed against other companies that completed on behalf of the UK. So there are multiple levels of benchmarking that we provide. What we then do is we take that overall score, and the assessment is put bucket into the 3 pillars. So we've got culture, environment, and support. And for each of those pillars, there's an individual score. So you can see here in this example, this company has hit achieving in 2 of the 3, and then excelling in the 3rd pillar, with a peer group average just slightly behind the overall scores in the 3rd pillar, and in the 2nd pillar, their score slightly behind the average, and in the 1st pillar, the same thing. So you start to get a sense of where you sit against both peer group and overall at a pillar level. We then take that to the next level down, and we provide exactly the same data at a standards level. So each of our 3 pillars, culture, environment, workplace, and support, and then we give benchmarking data, which is drilling right into each of our standards, our 10 standards, through communication, senior leadership, transparency and accountability, and so on and so forth. And essentially, the assessment is a very big data set in its own right, but it does challenge organizations on how they are using data. And Alison alluded to this when she was speaking about the framework. So we ask questions around companies utilizing data and publishing it externally. We ask questions around data that's provided to the CEO and the board, to senior leadership. We ask questions around what data and KPIs are given to people managers to manage and lead their teams. We ask what data is collected and gathered around impact in certain parts of the organization. So, for example, if you have a mental health champions or mental health first aiders network, what kind of impact are they having, and what data are you gathering around that, and how are you gathering it? So, to give you an indication, there's over 150 areas that we ask our members and those taking part in the assessment to assess themselves against to provide this overall report. And then finally, just to touch on an example of the kind of detail that we then go into in the final part of the report, and this runs to about 25 or 30 pages. Every single area that we question and challenge on, we play back to the company that has taken part in the survey. They get to see what their response was. They get to see their sector peer group average score was, and they get to see the overall score. So again, there is benchmarking at an overall score level, at a pillar level, at a standard level, and then you can start to benchmark even at individual question levels. So that whole benchmarking sits right across the assessment, and that's the basis of why it exists. It's a baseline tool. And when we jump into questions with Karen, I'm sure she'll talk a bit more about that. But I just wanted to give you an indication of what this particular assessment does as just one example of a data set that you can gather on behalf of your organization to move your wellbeing strategy and plans forward. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and jump back into the conversation. And now I'm delighted to introduce you to Karen. So Karen, maybe I can start by asking you to introduce yourself.
Thank you very much, Phil. And hi, it's great to be here. Sorry. So I'm Karen. I'm the Organisational Wellbeing Lead at professional services firm BDO. I'm based in London, but we have 17 offices around the UK. So it's very much sort of UK based, but also having that workforce that is spread across the UK as well. So I've been working in wellbeing now, in organisational wellbeing, for around 14 years. And for me, I suppose what's really important from my perspective around sort of the role that I do and what really I'm really passionate about is moving that dial, is moving us forward in a meaningful way as an organisation. And that means moving our people forward as well. So it really is for me around how we bring all of that together and can use the data to help us on that journey. And if I just may, it's we've now completed 3 Thriving at Work assessments. And if I look back to our first one, we achieved excelling, which I was really proud of at that moment in time and still remain so. But it was a great achievement. But having all of that data, having that knowledge there, that was, we knew some of it, we thought, but actually that underpinned it for us. It gave us that benchmarking that meant, okay, now we know this is our starting point. From this point forward, we had previous data, but it gave us that moment to say, right, this is our line in the sand, and this is how we're going to move forward from this as well. So for me, it's been a great way of actually helping me to structure our strategy and actually think about where we're going to focus our attention going forward as well.
Thanks, Karen. Really helpful introduction. Maybe we can start off with the assessment. I'd just be interested when you look back on the 3 years, and we've just met with you a couple of weeks ago, in fact, to go through last year's assessment. And congratulations on your score, progress indeed. But did the assessment ever highlight any blind spots or any assumptions within your leadership or your people management practices, or even where the assessment reinforced what you're doing is working?
Yeah, so I think with regards to blind spots, something that really came up for me was that procurement piece. So it was an area where in that very first report, as I was completing the report, I noticed that actually that was sort of, I was unable to give as much information in that space that I would have liked to. So that for me was a blind spot that actually showed up quite quickly in that first assessment for me. And it's one that we continue to sort of struggle with a little bit. It's one that I'm continuing to work on and focus on. So that was one thing that came up, and that I shared that across as well, across our leadership, because I think something there as well is really important, is that you get so much data back and you have to really think about where you focus your attention. So I haven't focused my true attention in that procurement space as yet, but it is on this year's agenda following our last meeting. So it is going into the plan for that. Something else that showed up actually as a blind spot with the data was that we had lots of training that we were offering, lots of training around mental health. But our blind spot was, what is mental health training? So does it have to have that mental health in the title? How long does it need to be for? Is it just an introduction bit? And we had a really great debate internally around, well, what are we comfortable with here as well? What are we comfortable in saying? What are we comfortable in saying, right, this is where we can say that, yes, we're talking about mental health awareness here, and this is where we can say, well, actually, we're touching on it, but we're not going far enough to say that. I think other things is around the data part for me is how we share it. So it was a lot of our senior leaders were blind to that data because we hadn't shared it with them before. So it was new data to them as well. So that was really interesting, because all of a sudden they were asking lots of questions around different things because they had a data set to look at, and they became very curious about what we did, how we did it, where we were focusing our attention. And the problem is, or one of the concerns then, is that we try to do everything all at once, and that's obviously that can be a little bit of a problem as well, because we only have so much time capacity, and including with our people too, it is around there. But I think that procurement one is the one that I always sort of roll back to within that as well.
Thanks, Karen. Really helpful. And maybe Alison, I can jump to you, just because Karen mentioned the procurement piece. That maybe you can explain what the procurement piece is. But also, because you and I did an awful lot of feedback meetings, maybe talk a little bit about threads and themes that we see, because I would say procurement piece was a really good example of a theme that we saw recurring across firms taking part in the assessment.
Yeah, absolutely. So this would be in relation to our framework and standard 4, which is ecosystem. So this is really for organisations, I guess, who are more mature in their journeys and their progress. And it's very much around how can we as organisations influence good practice across our ecosystems. So that will be anything from our supply chains, that will be engagements with clients and customers. But specifically within the assessment, there is measurement around the procurement process. So the questions that organisations are asking their suppliers. So, very common, we'll see things relating to, modern slavery, inclusion and equity is certainly areas which have been built into procurement related questionnaires over the years. But what we want to see is that organisations are now asking questions about wellbeing, and some of that will relate to very what we would consider probably quite, basic and fundamental kind of employment policies and rights like fair pay. But this will also be, in terms of what we want to see, are questions around what are you providing your employees with, confidential counselling support? Do your employees have, the opportunities to apply for, various different types of work-life balance approaches? Are your supplier organisations promoting health and wellbeing, to their employees? So what we want to see, and this is very much more of a carrot rather than a stick, is that organisations are firstly asking the questions, because in just asking the questions, that's going to, particularly, for many of our members who are doing the assessment, they're large organisations, they're going to have lots of suppliers, and what these large organizations do and ask is going to be quite influential in terms of what that supplier feels they need to do. So the first thing we ask is that the questions are asked of suppliers, but the second thing that we ask is that there is some form of what we call challenge. So if there are responses coming back that say, no, we're not doing any of these things, that are, organizations are saying, okay, well, let's talk about that. How can we help you? How can we share what we're doing, in this space? So it's very much around how we influence, good practice. So I would say across the board, that is one of the more challenging standards. The second standard that I think is, a consistent theme and challenge is around people management, so the line manager role. And, again, the expectation in what we're looking organisations to do is very much around, how are you providing that kind of implicit expectation of line managers to support team wellbeing? How are you providing them with the education, the guidance, the resources, so that they have the skills and the knowledge to do that well? And then how are you ensuring that they are measured against that? So there is some very explicit expectations built into competency frameworks, role descriptions, and then that and what they do as line managers. So the actions that they are taking are then measured. And then ultimately we're looking for compensation to be linked to that. But, that's kind of, very, very mature levels. One thing I would just like to pull out, and it links a little bit to the people management standards around training engagement. This has been consistently a theme that we're seeing, that so many organisations that we work with now are offering training. So it's being created, produced, offered to over 75% of different populations, but the engagement is really low. And I think that's a really interesting data point, because that's saying something around the levels of engagement of certain populations in the organisation, or highlighting barriers where perhaps people don't feel they have the time to attend training. So, I would say, data points like that are really helpful, because they tell a bit of a story. There is a narrative that sits behind that, and that can be really helpful insight. And I think the benchmarking as an exercise is also one. And in these feedback sessions that Phil and I have been doing, a lot of organisations have been going, oh, okay, but I can see the benchmarking number, and it looks like we're really behind because everyone else seems to be doing this. So again, it's useful data and insight into, well, what is actually quite standard practice now in your peer organisations, and then some of the outliers like the compensation point, which obviously we want organisations to aspire to.
Thanks, Alison. And obviously one of the data points that you would want managers to have is metrics around their team's wellbeing in the ideal world. Karen, I'm going to jump back to you, if I may. You started to talk a little bit about the blind spot of senior leadership and not having the information because you hadn't given them the information. So thinking more broadly, just about data, wellbeing data generally, and internal reporting. So how are you integrating that into your reporting to senior leadership, the board, regional heads, however you're structured, to maintain that momentum and accountability?
Yeah, great question. So we have a people, culture and purpose exec team. So part of that feed into our leadership team, and we have leadership team members part of that exec as well. And we provide them with regular data points. So, and we ensure we include that narrative around it as well, because it is important that we do give them more than just the information. We want to give them the story around that as well, and what we're seeing and what we're hearing. So we do that and we share that with them. What we also do is we think about who else this would be helpful to see. So we speak to our people managers and we share information with our people managers, and we do this a number of ways. We have sessions for our people managers where we share sort of some of what we're seeing from a wellbeing perspective. So I run sessions with our people managers where I embed into that some of our data points so that they're actually getting to hear it, but they're also getting to use that in case studies that I work with them on as well, so that they can start thinking about, well, how is this impacting my team? So if we're looking at this from more of an organizational level around all of our managers and what all of our people are saying, then I can start to think about, okay, how can I build that in so that they receive this in a way that is meaningful and they're getting something out of it as well. So I run a program called Conversations around Mental Health and Wellbeing, and within that I bring in sort of a lot of data points and some case studies where I'm using those data points within that. So we're sharing it in that meaningful way. We also share through our mental health first aiders and through our wellbeing champions as well. So we share back to them. So it's really important that we get lots of data points in. And once I've reviewed and I've consolidated them, looked at them and validated them, I will share back to our mental health first aiders and wellbeing champions in their update meetings so that they can get to see some of those in the role that we ask them to do within BDO or that they volunteer to do within BDO. If we share this data back with them, they're starting to see the impact that they're having, but also they can share that back through their own regions. As I said, we've got 17 offices, so I can't be in all of those offices. So it is about me giving them information that they can share back again in a meaningful way. So we ran a summer games campaign just over a year ago now, and within that campaign, it was very much focused on, it sounds like summer games, just sort of really physical activity, but it was really embedded in in mental well-being as well, and our mental health. And I set out at the very beginning and I asked people questions at the very beginning. So I'd done pre and post evaluation, and then 6 months further on as well. And I asked people around how they felt their energy levels and their mental well-being was. And mental well-being, even after 6 months, was 7% higher. Wow. And energy was also higher. So it's about moving that dial as well, and having that data point and sharing that back to the regions, because that encourages and helps other points as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Karen. My next question actually ties in with the question that we've had sent in to us. So the question we've had sent in to us is, how can organizations avoid data overload and focus on the few wellbeing metrics that genuinely drive meaningful change? So that's a question that's been submitted. Another one, I like that. How can you prioritize what data to use? My question was around what advice would you give organizations who are earlier in their journey about getting maximum value from data, including the assessment, and turning that into practical action? So it's essentially the same question, just repackaged. It's how do you prioritize when you've got all of this data? And you saw the slide I shared.
Yeah. One thing that I did when I first started BDO 4 years ago, I did a mind map of all the data points that I thought would be available to me. I still have that mind map today. I printed it off, and that was really me just trying to think of absolutely everything that was available. Do I access half of that data now? No. And I didn't at that point either, but it was just me trying to ascertain what was available to me. The question I then had to ask myself is, what problem am I trying to solve? What do I need to do now? Mm-hmm. And that was really, but I wanted to have a really holistic view of what would be available to me. So when I then asked that question, I could then look at this list that I'd compiled, this mind map, and actually say, well, that would be helpful and that wouldn't. I'm not going to get any value from adding that in. So it helped me to determine what would be helpful and what wouldn't. And one of the things at that point in time, by the way, was we have a fantastic wellbeing offering and benefits offering, because they're very much combined. And in that, our people weren't seeing that. So there was a gap between what we had and what our people thought we had or thought they had access to. And I needed to narrow that gap. That was one of my first things that I felt that we needed to do. And because leadership was saying to me, we need more. And it was like, actually, I did a sort of an audit of what we had and a look at the data. And that was my first thing to do there. So I looked at the data to think, okay, what's going to help me demonstrate that we've narrowed this gap? And then what steps am I going to take? And then have a look at that data after as well, a period of time after I'd done that piece of work. And we simplified some of the pathways into that support. I created a signposting toolkit to help people access that support. And then when we went back and measured it, and we used our listening program, which is our annual survey here as well. And it was about BDO caring about their well-being, that they had access to resources, and that question improved over that period of time. But we also asked other questions as well, but it was really around that. But also we noticed that our EAP data increased a little bit, but we had access to something called DigiCare Plus, so where we had access to unlimited GP appointments and mental health support. Now that actually increased by 116%.
Okay.
So over doubled.
Right.
And that was a data point that our leadership team were really interested in, that demonstrated, and we've managed to retain that, by the way, that element of growth within there.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a great way of actually evidencing that. So really thinking about, my advice would be, really think about what problem it is you're trying to solve first, because we can't do everything at once. We need to think about what is the thing that's going to make the most difference, and then focus on that. And then we often see other things come alongside that we actually improve along the way as well, which can be really helpful. So that would be my one key piece of advice, is really to think about what you're trying to solve, and then think about what data is going to help me there.
And I'll probably take it one step higher than that, Karen, and I would say the problems you're trying to solve should be aligned to the strategy that you have developed.
Yeah.
That's really key. So often we hear of organizations that are rushing at well-being solutions, but actually don't have a strategy, and therefore it feels very disjointed and uncontrolled. And then the confusion comes with, what data do you need, because you don't know what problem you're trying to solve. We've had another question submitted. I'm not sure who's submitting these questions. They must have read my crib sheet of questions, because it kind of is aligned to another question I want to ask you, Karen. So the question that's been submitted is, what type of information are the mental health first aiders and wellbeing champions sharing? Our business is always very concerned over logging or sharing what they see as confidential. So, and what I wanted to ask you about, have you experienced any blockers in trying to either access or use certain data, and how have you addressed that? So they're slightly different, but also similar. And I know from our conversations and exchanges, you've got what I think is a really nice way of trying to measure and help around the impact of your mental health first aiders. So maybe you can share that.
Yeah, of course. So with regards to mental health first aiders, I would say we are quite established in our mental health first aider community. However, when it comes to collecting data, we're on the journey with many others as well, because there is that concern around what data we do collect and what do we do with that once we have it as well. So I always encourage our mental health first aiders to think about when they're using their skills that they learn in the 2-day program that they attend, and in the subsequent refresher programs as well. Because often it isn't that they get a phone call to say, I need to have a conversation. Sometimes that does happen, but many of the conversations happen and they evolve following as part of a different conversation, as part of a conversation about something completely different. And then a mental health first aider may notice something and may start to use their mental health first aid skills as part of that conversation. So I think when we think about measuring mental health first aiders, we need to think broadly about when they're using their skills and allowing them to notice that, rather than just thinking about somebody has called me and they need a conversation.
Yeah.
We do not collect data on from the mental health first aider on the person they've had the conversation with. So we're not collecting individual data on the person that is receiving the mental health first aid. But we do want to know that our mental health first aiders are supported and have what they need. So we do ask them to let us know if they need anything further following that conversation, and we signpost them onto our EAP. We're taking that a step further quite soon, and we will be collecting additional data. However, again, this will not involve collecting any information, any personal information on the person that is receiving mental health first aid at that time as well. So I think from a data perspective, it's important that we collect this, but there is that concern, and we need to be really clear with people what we're collecting and how we're going to be using that, because otherwise we're doing so much work to destigmatize and to remove that stigma around mental health, So we need to be really clear and transparent about what data we're collecting following conversations as well. With regards to data that I've struggled with, I would say that I'm quite curious about a lot of the data that we hold. But I go back to that, what am I using this data for, and is it going to be helpful to me? But some of the things that I've looked at are including things like our physical first aider data as well, because that can be helpful in thinking about our broader sort of mental health as well. If we're starting to see lots of people that are getting headaches, sort of having stomach upsets, that might be telling us something else as well, through that physical first aider element as well, and accidents and near misses. So I'm starting to look at that a little bit, and that's been a little bit harder for me to look at. But also, and this is something that Alison mentioned earlier, really thinking about, we term it our employee relations data. So really thinking about that sort of, what are our employee relations team? What cases are they seeing? What are the themes from those cases? And are there any particular spots around the business that we can support, and we can sort of notice that and put in place an intervention in that area as well? So I think looking at that data is really important, but it's not always as easy to access as well.
Okay, brilliant. Look, thank you, Karen. That was really helpful, and thank you for sharing that piece around impact and your mental health first aiders. Alison, I've got a couple more questions, so I'm going to try and get through these quite quickly. This one is a little bit of a long one. The framework highlights that individual level interventions often have no effect without organizational change. In my experience, many companies still struggle to move past reactive support and cultural awareness. How can we more effectively push the environment pillar, specifically Standard 7, which is working conditions, to ensure that job design and workload management are treated as primary preventative health measures rather than secondary considerations? I work in organizational wellbeing, but come from a clinical background, really infuriating at times. Thanks, Ollie. Alison.
Yes. So, the point being made in the framework around individual interventions is that the approach of just trying to fix the individual does not work in isolation. And there's been some considerable research done around that point. In fact, the only individual-led intervention that actually makes a difference is volunteering. But that's a topic for another day. So essentially what we're looking at is here, there are team-level interventions, there are organisational interventions. The environment pillar and Standard 7 and the kind of environment, those three standards, is very much around the day-to-day experience of people. So it's the capability, the competence and the effectiveness of line managers. It's then Standard 7, which is very much around the kind of day-to-day, the working environment, the work that you produce, the working relationships, psychosocial risk. And that's really where that sits. So I think, there are various ways of measuring that. I mean, employee sentiment would be an obvious one. I think asking the right questions around, levels of job satisfaction, levels of stress within the organisation, the feedback on, manager competence and capability. This is also around to what extent, there are conversations being had through performance review processes around, wellbeing risk, around, the extent to which, an individual's wellbeing is being affected by the, work. So there's lots of different data points that you can ask here, but I would say, risk assessments, psychosocial risk assessments, and employee sentiment data would be the one that I would look at. And then I think the thing is, it's about how that data is then used and reported. And I talked a lot in the beginning about executive board level, but actually I think this is about giving, line managers, the insights and the data themselves, because they can't fix it if they don't know it's a problem. So I think having some of that feedback in management scorecards, which is another thing that we advocate through for our assessments, is really helpful and useful, and can help to, steer line managers in certain directions and to measure progress that they're being made in terms of what the organisation wants to see across that kind of management population. So I know that's not the perfect answer. I'm conscious that we're running out of time, but do have a full read of that framework. And then I would also signpost you to the World Wellbeing Movement and their Wellbeing Playbook as well, because that's got some really helpful information in there.
Thanks, Alison. I'm going to shout one more question out, Karen, before we close. So it's kind of a quick fire-ish. So it's for you. Do you ever capture any thematic data in terms of the issues colleagues speak to your MHFAs about?
That is something that we have actually just launched. So we are capturing that, and we've done it through, so the way that we're doing that is actually through a drop down list, so that we can actually, there's other comments that people can add, but I've actually selected about 8 choices that people can choose from, and then they can add a bit more detail, but that enables me to collect that thematic insights so that we can really start to look at that as well. We also do the same on the signposting as well that's given out at that meeting, so we can see if we see any upturns in our data points as well from those. But yeah, it's really important that we do move forward, and that we collect this in a more structured way than we have, because we've got it anecdotally, but now we're actually collecting it in a way that is very formulaic, and we're going to be able to move forward with and report on once a quarter as well, and feed that back again through to our leadership team, so and our people culture and purpose committee as well.
Great question, well timed as you've just launched that, and a great answer, thank you. We are pretty much there, we're almost at the hour. My thanks to Alison and to Karen for joining today. Really helpful, really insightful. I hope for those of you on the call you found it of value and interest. We will follow up after this with some information that we shared today, including the slides that we presented earlier, albeit slightly broken up, and some data points that Alison spoke to. We'll make sure we share those with you as well, and contact details should you want to come back to us and chat to us any more about anything we talked about today. So with that, I'm going to close the call. Thank you very much. Good afternoon.